Welcome to the Vital Spirit podcast. I'm Dr. Kelly Livingston, a naturopathic physician and your guide to a new health reality, one that connects body, mind, and spirit. Together, we'll dive deep into the art and science of holistic healing. Through working with hundreds of women through midlife transitions, I've discovered something profound. Most of our physical and emotional challenges are rooted in a maladaptive stress response. And true healing begins when we regulate our nervous system. Each episode will explore complex health topics in simple, empowering ways, uncover the deeper wisdom within each of us, and share practical tools for nervous system regulation to help you awaken your vital force and create lasting wellness. So, if you're ready to reconnect with yourself, your health, and your purpose, let's begin this journey together so you can experience life more fully human and deeply healed. Hi, and welcome back to the Vital Spirit podcast. This is part 2 of our deep dive into homeopathy and perimenopause. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I would really recommend starting there because that's where I laid the foundation for understanding symptoms, the vital force, and the law of similars. And today we're going to build on that. This is where we move into how homeopathy actually works in practice, and we're going to talk about potency and dilution, how I think through cases clinically, and how perimenopause becomes a time where patterns become incredibly clear and incredibly treatable. So let's pick up where we left off. So you're probably like, what are you talking about if you've never learned about homeopathy before? So let's start with a really concrete example of coffee. I often use this one with patients. So most of us know that if you drink coffee, it's going to keep you awake, right? You drink a whole cup of actual coffee, it's going to keep you awake. But homeopathic coffee actually helps you sleep. So if I have a patient who's laying there at night and her thoughts are just going, like a ticker tape parade, and she cannot fall asleep, I might give homeopathic coffee, which, yes, is a very, very dilute amount of that substance. So say you took a drop of coffee and you put it into water and you shook it up, and then you took a drop of that and you put it into another cup of water and you shook that up, and you kept going until there was less than Avogadro's number of that substance. So basically no more coffee left. You just have the energetic imprint of the coffee. Then that is actually going to help that person sleep. Pretty cool, right? And this is where homeopathy is fundamentally different from pharmacology. In pharmacology, we often think in terms of opposition, reduce inflammation, block the receptor, suppress the cough, lower the fever, calm the nervous system, sedate the symptom. Again, there's a place for that, but that is not what is happening in homeopathy. In homeopathy, we're not opposing the symptom, we're matching the pattern through similitude, and that match stimulates the organism to reorganize itself and heal. The remedy is not doing the healing in a direct mechanical sense. It's not forcing the body to do something it otherwise would not do. It's acting as a signal, a stimulus, a highly specific input to a living, responsive system. And this leads us beautifully into a conversation about dilution and potency. So if you've ever used a homeopathic remedy, you probably used a little tube of white pellets. You can also use homeopathy in liquid form, but when you're using those little tubes, you might be using a certain dilution or potency. So homeopathic remedies are prepared through serial dilution and succussion, as I was describing before. A substance is diluted step by step, and at each step, it's vigorously agitated. And this is how potencies are created. So a 6C or a 30C, which maybe is the potency that you could get at Whole Foods, or maybe a 200C and so on, reflect repeated cycles of preparation. From a conventional material perspective, yes, at higher potencies, there may be no measurable molecule of the original substance remaining. So especially as you move on to what I might use miasmatically or in personality constitutional homeopathy, a 1M or a 10M, there's really no amount of that substance remaining. And that's the source of a lot of the skepticism around homeopathy. But skepticism does not erase observation. Clinically, what we see is that different potencies behave differently, and that behavior isn't random. And I get it. When I first started in medical school, I wasn't super familiar with homeopathy. I had kind of tried some on my own before I was actually trained in it. And I am a super open-minded skeptic. I want to know the data, the science, even though I am this mystic seeker and I obviously am a naturopathic physician obsessed with plants and nature cure and homeopathy now. But when I was first sitting there, I was kind of like, all right, prove it to me. Over the years, the more that I've used it with my daughter, I've used homeopathy with so many patients, and you see it work. That's the proof, right? The proof is in the experience. And so I really do advise you to, if you're curious, just try some remedies. And that's one of the most beautiful things about homeopathy is because it is so dilute, it is so safe to start to learn to do on your own. Okay, so lower potencies tend to act more physically, more locally on an acute or surface level expression. And we usually repeat them more frequently. So if you have a bee sting and you're using apis, or maybe you don't have apis around, so you grab ledum, you're going to do a 6C or a 30C, and you're probably going to dose that frequently. Again, arnica is a good example. If you have a bruise and that's a local physical acute symptom, you're going to do probably a 6C or a 30C. Whereas if I'm using arnica for trauma, I'm probably going to work up to a 200 or even a 1M, depending on the person. Higher potencies tend to act more deeply and globally, especially on the mental, emotional organization, the nervous system, the deeper constitutional or personality pattern, and they usually require more restraint and repetition. LM potencies, which are often underdiscussed outside more serious homeopathic study, can allow a gentler and more graduated engagement with the system. And they're really useful in sensitive patients or in chronic cases where you want sustained movement without a more abrupt impact. So potency is not strength in the conventional sense. Higher is not simply stronger. Potency really reflects depth, scope, and the level at which the remedy is likely to engage the organism. So this does take time to learn. But again, with the acute remedies, if you just want to start to see, like, does this even work? You can start with a 6 or a 30C, which are readily available. This matters so much in perimenopause because perimenopause is complex and it's chronic. It lasts for years. So a woman in perimenopause might present with an acute layer, a constitutional layer, and a deeper miasmatic or structural tendency all at once. So a woman might have sleep that's recently deteriorated. Maybe she's having trouble falling asleep and we try coffea, or maybe she's waking up in the middle of the night and her cycle is changing. It's really disorganized. She doesn't know when she's going to get her period anymore. And maybe when she does get it, it's heavy, or other months it's really light and it's confusing her. And her nervous system might be more reactive. And at the same time, the long-standing way her body has organized in response to stress might be becoming a lot more visible. So prescribing is not simply about identifying a remedy picture, although again, when I was learning homeopathy, we would memorize the remedies and the type of kind of person that remedy might match with. So we might have caricatures that we could remember the remedies by, but that's really just to learn the patterns. And I'll definitely have episodes that do go more into depth around psychology in homeopathy, around miasmatic prescribing and how we can inherit miasms. Really in-depth conversations can be had here. But essentially, acute prescribing is addressing a current state with a clear onset, a clear expression of symptoms. Constitutional prescribing is addressing the long-standing pattern of the person, the way they tend to respond under stress and over time. And miasmatic prescribing goes even deeper still, looking at inherited or structural tendencies that shape how illness unfolds across layers and over generations. In practice, those categories are not always neatly separated, but the distinction matters because the intention of the prescription matters, and the dose or potency you will use in each case will be different. So I did want to mention it. So let's say a patient comes in with a recent acute panic spike on top of an otherwise coherent system. So that's a totally different prescribing pattern than sitting with a woman whose entire menopausal transition is unmasking a pattern of over control and depletion and grief and reactivity and collapse that has been an undercurrent for decades. They're not the same cases, even if both patients say, I have anxiety and I'm not sleeping. So You might hear a patient say, I get headaches or I get migraines. There's going to be a completely different root cause and reason, a completely different set of patterns, and then a completely different remedy given. So again, it's not here's a pill for your headaches. And another key thing to remember is that when I'm repertorizing, so when I'm listening to a patient and they're explaining physical or mental or emotional or general symptoms, and then I'm going into my materia medica and I'm looking for those symptoms and how they might match with a certain remedy, I always reflect back to Hahnemann's emphasis on the mental and emotional state being so important. He's very clear that the mental and emotional state is often the most decisive factor in selecting the remedy. Not secondary, not a side note, not something you consider after the physical symptoms, but central, because those layers often show most clearly how the organism is organizing itself. They're less superficial patterns, they're less disguised. They really show you how the system is reacting, how it's defending itself or compensating, how the system collapses under stress or infection, how it avoids or withdraws. So again, you're really starting to learn that you're having a relationship essentially with the patient's organism or the vis moving through that organism. And in perimenopause, when we have our hormonal transitions occurring and our regulations shifting, maybe our nervous system's window of tolerance is smaller, what changes most importantly is the system's buffering capacity. And so as progesterone declines and estrogen is fluctuating and your nervous system is less buffered, you're sleeping less, your HPA axis is dysregulated, the patterns that emerge are going to be what we use to select a remedy. When a woman says, I don't feel like myself anymore, what I want them to explain to me is, okay, what were the ways you used to feel and what are some of the ways you feel now? And is there a common pattern there that might help me pick the right remedy? And clinically, what I often think is not that she has become less herself, but that the system is becoming more honest. We can almost detect things that had been underlying in the system all along, especially if you get really good at listening for patterns. So I think of perimenopause and menopause as a system that's less filtered, less buffered, and less able to maintain the old compensatory arrangement. Your bucket is overflowing, essentially. And this is a great moment to mention and speak about things like antidepressants or anxiolytics or hormone replacement therapy, menopausal hormone therapy. So I'm not anti any of those things. As I've mentioned in episodes before, there are cases where those interventions might be appropriate, helpful, or even necessary. But remember, there's a therapeutic order and they're at the top of the therapeutic order. And what I see over and over again is that many women are being offered these options before anyone has had a real conversation with them about what the body is actually revealing. And homeopathy is such a great gateway into having these conversations. Very often, I'll give a remedy and it will open up a conversation around burnout or stress physiology and around what is depleting that patient. Are there any things in their daily life that are renewing them and bringing them joy? So, just listening to a patient to select a remedy is healing in and of itself. But then the remedy selection and then going back and checking in what's changed, what's shifted, what's the body telling us now? All of that is part of the healing process. It's never just estrogen deficiency. It's never only depression. It's a system that's been living in trauma physiology with chronic stress or overfunctioning or boundary collapse or suppressed grief, maybe unprocessed anger for many years. So often perimenopause is a time where we can no longer keep those patterns hidden. So hormone replacement therapy might help in some of the physical symptoms or aspects of that transition. It may absolutely help some women, but it does not address those deeper patterns of how that organism has been organizing itself over the years. It does not address the deeper trauma. It does not address the emotional styles we talked about in our previous episodes, right? And homeopathy can, when it's well matched and well timed, help the system to reveal what it needs to reorganize those patterns, not by pathologizing or medicalizing it, but by working with it. So let's give an example of what homeopathy looks like in real life. I had a patient who was in her mid 40s. She was still getting her period, but clearly in transition. And she came in telling me that she felt her hormones were out of control. She was having anxiety. She was not sleeping well, waking between 2 and 4 a.m. And she wanted help with her hormones because she figured that that's what was going on. But as she began to speak, it became very clear that her presenting complaint was not the whole case. And remember, when we say chief complaint, that's how we chart medically. So I'm not saying that she was complaining. The true crux of her case was the way that she organized under stress. So her mind moved forward constantly. She was very anticipatory, highly mental and intellectual, structured and controlled. And she would wake up and immediately begin scanning what needed to be done, going through her lists, what could go wrong, what had she not finished the day before, what needed to be managed the next day. And it was not chaotic, but it was very organized vigilance. And as we talked more, the history made it even clearer. And the history she shared with me was that she had been that way as a teenager, unable to shut her mind off at night. And in her 20s and 30s, she compensated by becoming highly productive and externally organized. So the perimenopause transition did not create a new kind of anxiety. It exposed the cost of the one she always had. It exposed the cost of the one she had always used to function. So she had used that anxiety in a good way to essentially become highly productive and successful. But the question now is not what do I give her for menopausal anxiety? It is what is the pattern of this system and how is that pattern now expressing itself under reduced buffering capacity? What is becoming so clear, so evident that we can't ignore anymore? And that pattern is what helps me match a remedy. Here's a totally different patient, also in perimenopause, also using the language of anxiety and not sleeping, but an entirely different case. The moment she began speaking, the quality was totally different. There was pressure, there was urgency to her speech. She had to get the thought out, and she was talking quite a bit in her visit really, really fast. It was not disorganized, just accelerated as though if things were not expressed, they would build. And she did not wake with scanning thoughts. She woke activated as though something had already started internally and now she needed to move her body. So she would get up, walk, do things. There was heat, flushing, and the sense of upward movement she described. And one of the details that came out was that she could not tolerate anything tight around her neck. If you're a homeopathy head, then you know exactly what remedy this is. And this matters because it's not a trick clue, it's not magic, but because it's part of the pattern and it's a keynote for the remedy. So this was not organized vigilance like that first patient. This was pressure, intensity, need for discharge, and a system that was building toward expression. Again, if you call both of these women anxious or having insomnia, you totally lose the point. And then there's a quieter perimenopausal woman who does not announce herself with her physical intense symptoms, but she says she does not feel like herself. And when you ask her what that means, there might be a long pause, not because she's confused, but because what she's describing is harder to access in language. She's tired, but it's not just tired. Everything takes more effort. Things that used to be available to her internally, like energy, sexual desire, tolerance, feel further away, almost muffled. She loves her family, but she sometimes wants to be left alone. And then she feels guilty for even thinking that. There's often a history of caretaking, holding things together, over functioning under obligation, doing what must be done. And now things feel blurry. And she's beginning to not only experience some anxiety, but low mood and depletion and disconnection. And her system can no longer sustain the old level of relational and functional output and caretaking the way that it used to, but it's expressing that through withdrawal, flatness, heaviness, or reduced emotional availability. This is not the same as the previous two cases, right? So this is why remedies like sepia, lachesis, pulsatilla, simicifuga, ignatia, natrum muriaticum, arsenicum, calicarbonicum, and all many others can be called common menopausal remedies. And yet the phrase itself is kind of misleading. I don't want you to think these are the remedies for menopause. There are remedies for patterns that often become visible during perimenopause and menopause. So you're probably like, okay, what remedies? Tell us more remedies. So sepia is one of the most well known here, and it's one that I use a lot because it's often prescribed as kind of a stereotype. So we can picture the sepia case as a woman who's not just tired and wanting space, but also has this deep depletion that does follow that prolonged expenditure, often with emotional blunting and irritability towards those who make demands. So, not wanting to be around the family, that example I just gave. Sometimes these women can have reduced access to desire, a sense of heaviness or dragging, sometimes pelvic symptoms like bearing down, which immediately when I said that, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't think of sepia for a patient the other day. So that's how it works. I do think homeopathy is part magic, but the way that it works is by knowing the patterns, knowing your remedies, and then giving them when you hear those keynotes expressed by a patient. So sepia we might use for irritability, but often there's too little replenishment to the system over a long period of time. Lachesis is almost opposite of that. And here in lachesis, the system's not flattening, it's overflowing. There's pressure, heat, intensity, aggravation. Those patients talk really fast. Sometimes they feel better right when they get their period, right? The day that they start bleeding. They have that strong internal sensation that needs to move or release. That's that case I was describing before. And it's very helpful in hot flashes, but I don't want us to just think hot flashes, lachesis. I want us to think about that specific organization of intensity. And yes, they might say they don't want things around their neck, which might prompt me to look at lachesis and ask some more questions and get to know that patient better and get to know the patterns better. Pulsatilla belongs where the patient is softer, more fluid, maybe more relationally oriented, and changeable. So symptoms are shifting frequently, moods shift. The patient might feel better with connection and company and tenderness, and there's a genuine dependency of a certain kind, not pathologically, but a system that organizes through relationship. And so their symptoms might really reflect that permeability and changeability. Simicifuga might be used where there's hormonal transition intertwined with nervous system irritability and instability. There might be muscular tension, emotional darkness or agitation, dread, headaches, an inner turbulence that maybe isn't described in the other remedies. And some women in perimenopause seem to live right at that intersection of endocrine changes, hormonal changes, and nervous system disturbance. And this is a great remedy in those cases. Whereas we might use sanguinaria where there are vasomotor symptoms that are really pronounced, like burning, flushing, upward movement of heat, and headaches. And it might be right-sided. So I haven't gotten a chance to talk about the sidedness of remedies and even timing, because again, I'm limited by time in this episode, but I did want you to start to think about those patterns some more. Ignatia is a remedy I'll use very often when there's emotional shock. Those patients might sigh or describe a lump in their throat. They might have inner conflict or alternating holding, releasing symptom picture. In some women, perimenopause unmasks what's been emotionally contained for years. And so Ignatia might be a remedy I reach for in grief and depletion from grief. Whereas Natrum muriaticum is also a grief remedy, but very often those patients have been silently enduring and they have this inward grief. They don't want to be consoled. They don't want anyone around them. And that cost of containment in perimenopause begins to show more physically, more emotionally, but the essential pattern remains this inward holding. Now, this is actually table salt, so I might also notice that they have swelling or edema, or maybe they actually feel better by the sea and by in salt air. So again, there's so many details that help me pick a remedy. I also want to mention arsenicum for anxiety, because arsenicum is a big remedy that we use when a patient might be more comfortable when they can control their environment. They might be really fastidious, have anticipatory thinking, anxiety and fear and restless internal instability are really central to this remedy. So these are often women who have functioned through control, and perimenopause reveals how much strain that has carried. So, my job is not to turn this into a menu, a homeopathy buffet, but to really help you refine perception. And remedy study is not list making, although it probably sounds that way today, but it's learning the shapes that human suffering and adaptation can take. It's really tracking patterns. And once the picture begins to clarify, as I get to know a patient more, as I've heard their unique symptom pictures, their unique mental and emotional states, potency enters at another level of precision. So I mentioned potency before, but essentially in perimenopause and menopause, more is not necessarily better. So a woman who has a deep and long standing symptom picture might be too reactive or too exhausted or too destabilized or essentially sensitive for an aggressive prescription. And a deeply reactive patient might need a lower potency. They might need more space and time between dosing and more supportive measures. Whereas a very coherent patient with a clear constitutional picture or personality pattern that I'm working on, it might be the appropriate time for a higher potency. And if their vitality is really strong and their system seems really ready, I might shift to a different potency in that case. So prescribing is not just about finding the right remedy. And in all honesty, it's not about the right remedy. A mentor of mine used to say, just give a remedy, right? Like get it close enough. And patients don't always love to hear that in the beginning. They want it to be the right remedy. But remember, we're working with energetic forces, we're working with the vis. It's not about choosing the right remedy. It's choosing how to engage with the system. And so, yes, learning remedies, learning potencies, learning timing are all part of the prescription, but also the relationship in selecting the remedy is healing in and of itself. And the patient telling their story and you listening as the practitioner or me listening is part of the healing. So, yes, in an acute physical symptom, repetition might be more frequent. And in constitutional work, especially with higher potencies, waiting is often essential. And a well-matched remedy might begin changing the organization of the system before physical symptoms have physically moved. And if you chase the symptom too quickly, you can interrupt the process. So this is one of the nuances about homeopathy. And it's why I have to check in with patients and see how things are changing and unfolding. And it's one of the places where less experienced prescribing often can go wrong. Again, there's not a right or wrong, but there might be a sense of anxiety that arises if a physical symptom is present still, even though the patient might say they're calmer, more coherent, less reactive. But those mental, emotional shifts can often tell you that the system has already begun to reorganize. So we have to listen carefully, essentially. And I want to mention here that this is where direction of cure becomes important. So healing does not always look like a simple linear disappearance of symptoms. Take the pill and it goes away, right? But what you first see is change in mental emotional state, then sleep shifts, then reactivity changes, then physical symptoms resolve. Not always, but sometimes this is a pattern that I see. Sometimes old layers become visible as deeper layers settle. So clinical judgment matters enormously here, but when you follow enough cases closely enough, you begin to recognize that genuine healing often has direction and it moves from deeper to more superficial, from the inside out, from more central to peripheral, from more vital to less vital functions, from more intensity to less, and in the opposite order that they appeared. So again, this is not a rigid rule, but this is a clinically meaningful pattern. And it's often how I know I'm on the right track. This is why a follow up in homeopathy is not just, are your symptoms better? Are they gone? It's interpretation. It's asking what has changed in the organization of your system. Do you feel more like yourself, less defended, more able to rest, more able to feel? Is there more space between stimulus and response? Is your cycle showing a different pattern? Is the old remedy no longer holding because our cases shifted levels, or maybe the original prescription only touched a certain specific layer and now we need to move on? And this is why this phase of life is such a great time to use homeopathy, because perimenopause does not just produce symptoms. It really reveals the architecture of a woman's system. It reveals where she has been compensating and pushing through or overextending, where she's been controlling or containing, dissociating, people pleasing, enduring, or overriding her own signals. And I'm not judging when I observe that. That is often what we've done through midlife, right? And that's why this feels like an initiation, because the old strategies no longer work in the same way. I say this over and over again. Our system is less willing to pay the cost of misalignment, whether that's physical misalignment or soul misalignment. But the things that you once ignored become too expensive for the system to keep ignoring. And the ways of living that once worked start to feel really intolerable. And the body responds, not subtly, but clearly in midlife. So when I say that homeopathy can be so powerful in perimenopause, I don't mean that it's just a natural way to treat hot flashes, although I've gotten rid of hundreds of women's hot flashes with homeopathy. It means that it gives us a way to meet the organism, to meet the vis of that patient at a level where it is revealing itself and to work with it. Homeopathy really allows our medicine to become more observant, more individualized and personalized, more precise, and in some ways more humble. Because ultimately, homeopathy is not about the pellet. It's not about the dropper bottle with the remedy. It's not about collecting exotic remedy names or using bird remedies, even though they're really cool. But it's about learning how to see what kind of patient has a disease or a collection of symptoms. As Sir William Osler said, it is more important to know what sort of patient has a disease than to know what sort of disease a patient has. It is important to learn how to see the patterns across mind, body, and spirit without splitting them apart and reducing them. How to see a symptom is the point of entry, but not the whole story. And in a phase of life like perimenopause, where the system is already in motion and becoming more honest, that kind of medicine can be profoundly clarifying for a woman. When you sit with enough of these cases, there comes a point where perimenopause stops looking like a cluster of symptoms to resolve, and it really starts looking like a system that is organizing itself to be heard. And if you stay with it and you begin to observe rather than immediately react and suppress a symptom, you start to see that what is changing is not just your hormones. It is your tolerance for ways of living that are no longer aligned. It is the body becoming really clearly honest with you. And very often there are things that we do need to make changes around at this phase of life, and homeopathy can be the gateway to that. Very often it can give our vital force what it needs to make those changes. And that is the deeper promise of homeopathy, not that it eliminates symptoms by magic. I love when patients are like, what is this magic? This worked so well, homeopathy for the win, right? And it's also not that it replaces all forms of care, but it keeps us close to the person, close to the pattern, close to the living intelligence of the body. And in doing that, it gives us a chance to reorganize and to truly heal. And this is why I come back to homeopathy time and time again, whether I'm using it acutely or I'm using it in a more chronic symptom picture, or I'm using it miasmatically. So I'll definitely have more episodes on it. But what I really hope came across in these 2 episodes is that you're beginning to shift in how you see your body, because your symptoms really are not random. That's why I'm saying this over and over again. Your symptoms are not your body failing you. They are not something to silence or override as quickly as possible. They're part of a pattern. They're part of a language, and they're part of how your system is communicating with you. And when you learn how to speak the language of your body and your body mind, that's where real healing begins. Not just finding the right remedy, but learning how to listen and learning how to observe and learning how to work with your body instead of against it. So if these episodes resonated with you, I would love for you to share them and send them to someone who needs them, or leave a review. It really helps this work reach more women who are navigating this transition and looking for a deeper way to understand what's happening in their bodies. And if you want to go deeper into this work with me, you can book a discovery call and explore ways that we can work together. Thank you for being here. Have a great day.